thank you for that warm welcome for our distinguished speaker tonight. Good evening and welcome to the Ford Presidential Museum. My name is Elaine Didier and it's my privilege to serve as the director of the museum here in Grand Rapids and the library in Ann Arbor. On behalf of the Archivist of the United States, welcome tonight. Tonight's program is made to you with support from our parent organization, the National Archives, as well as the Gerald Ford Presidential Foundation and the Hauenstein Center of Grand Valley State University. We always appreciate the opportunity to co-host programs with the Hauenstein Center, and I have to say that despite our multiple partnerships on both sides of the state, Hauenstein and Grand Valley are our closest partner, and it's always a pleasure. Tonight's program is being videotaped by C-SPAN for later broadcast, so I would ask your cooperation to turn off all cell phones and other electronic devices. Thank you. Also, following the presentation, our speaker will be taking your questions from the stage. As you know, Bill Brands is a master teacher, and tonight, ladies and gentlemen, we are all students in his class. He will ask that you ask your question from the seats, and Bill will repeat them so that they can be included on the tape. Following the program, we invite you to a reception in the lobby, and also you'll have the opportunity to meet our very distinguished speaker. Before beginning the program, I want to take this opportunity to alert you to some upcoming programs at the museum. On March 13th, Garrett Graff will be here discussing a very provocative book titled Raven Rock, the story of the U.S. government's secret plan to save itself while the rest of us die. If that doesn't get your attention, I don't know what to say. A very challenging book. Looking beyond that to more happy things, April 8th is Betty Ford's 100th birthday, and you are invited to free admission at the museum all day. And that week, on April 10th, the Tuesday, there will be a ribbon cutting and grand opening for our new Betty Ford Centennial exhibit, which is titled In Step with Betty Ford, and of course starts with her early background in dance, as you might appreciate. So our curatorial staff is very busy working right now on the final stages of design and writing. So the ribbon cutting, you're cordially welcome, is on April 10th. And then the next day, April 11th, the Ford Foundation is sponsoring a luncheon at Meyer Gardens featuring Susan Ford Bales, along with special speakers, among them former First Lady and Secretary of State Hillary Rodham Clinton, First Daughter Linda Johnson Robb, and moderator Andrea Mitchell. Tickets are limited and have been going fast, and I would ask that you contact the Ford Presidential Foundation for further information. And finally, this spring, scheduled now, May 15th, Scott Kaufman will be here. He has written a new biography on President Ford entitled Ambition, Pragmatism, and Party. So as you can see, we have a very full roster, and in the lobby are flyers, voila. So please pick up and mark your calendars. The flyer also includes programs to be offered at the library as well. So you're not limited to coming to programs at the museum. You can come over to Ann Arbor and see other good programs. Now tonight, as I said, we're partnering with the Hauenstein Center. And as you know, they have a very distinguished record for bringing in diverse and intellectually challenging and informative speakers. Tonight's program is no exception, and if you haven't heard Bill Brands before, I think that you'll be delighted, and if you have come as in the past, as I know many of you have, you're in for another treat. So please join me in welcoming my colleague, Gleaves Whitney, who is director of the Hauenstein Center, to introduce our speaker.
Well, thank you very much, Elaine, for that warm introduction and praise of the Hauenstein Center. We really treasure our partnership with the Ford. It's always a treat. And we will continue to bring you excellent programs that stimulate the mind and the heart for public service and love of our history. Happy Washington's birthday to our C-SPAN audience and also to the audience here at the Ford. It's really neat to be here recognizing Washington's birthday. This is one of the reasons we wanted Bill to be here on this special day. It's always a pleasure to host Bill Brands. We've had him back to West Michigan so many times I've lost count. But it's been enough that he should be awarded a lifetime tenure award at Grand Valley State University. Now, I've probably personally introduced you, Bill, more than a dozen times, and each time I go back and check his biography, I learn something new. And I wanted to share some of those new things with you tonight. You've probably heard me say that Bill's formal name is H.W. Brands. But did you know that the H.W. stands for History Whiz Kid? You've heard me say that Bill earned his master's and PhD in history, but did you know that he also had a master's degree in mathematics? He knows something that no historians know, and that's that if you multiply two negative numbers, like a -3 and a -4, you end up with a positive. So he understands things like that. You've heard me say that Bill is the author of more than 24 books. But did you know that they've been translated into French and German, Russian and Chinese, Japanese, Korean, and haiku? Maybe he'll explain. You've heard me say that a third of Bill's books are devoted to the presidents. If you go back and look at Jackson, Grant, T.R. Wilson, FDR, Ike, and Reagan. But did you know that he's also dined with the presidents in the White House? You've heard me say that Bill met long-lived Ralph Hallenstein for the first time at one of our events back in 2004. And they got along famously, swimmingly. But did you know that Ralph urged Bill to revise his studies of Ben Franklin and Andrew Jackson since Ralph knew both of them when he was a child? And speaking of childhood, you've heard me say that Bill has 3 children. But did you know that one of them, Hal, is a historian in his own right who teaches at Johns Hopkins? Finally, you've heard me say that Bill has an enthusiastic fan base around the United States. Indeed, I would say around the world because of all the translations. It's no surprise because many of his books end up being Pulitzer Prize finalists. But did you know that his most diehard fans are right here in West Michigan? Ladies and gentlemen, Bill Brands.
Thank you, Gleaves, for that very kind introduction. You've taught me some stuff I didn't even know about myself. You mentioned my son, Hal, who is a historian. And some of you in the audience perhaps can appreciate that there's nothing more gratifying for a parent who goes into the field to, well, initially, Hal got a little bit of boost from sometimes being confused with me because he was going to the field. Now I get a boost from being confused with him. And I'll get questions from reporters saying, well, I think you've got me confused with my son. He's the expert on that topic. Anyway, it's a delight to be back. And I see many friends from previous years. I'm thrilled that you liked it enough last time or the time before or something to come back. And I especially like the fact that this is an audience where I can try out ideas, where I can tell you about new stuff. Now, to some extent, you owe this to Gleaves, because Gleaves makes a point of anticipating everybody else. He doesn't just wait until the book is out. And I've already been giving the talk for a while. He asked me to talk about the book even before it's finished. And I wish, actually, though, Gleaves, that you had asked me to give this particular talk maybe a few months ago, because I just finished proofreading the galleys of the book. So the book has already been set in type. And it's reached the point where I really can't make any changes in it. And so one of the reasons that I like to teach history, I teach history to 500 freshmen every semester. And it requires me, it encourages me, it allows me to think in terms of the big questions of American history. And very often I find that my teaching is a real boost to my writing. Because when you try to explain something to someone who doesn't really know anything about it, and a lot of my students, and I certainly don't mean to disrespect the students that come from high schools in Texas. I'm not saying that they don't know any American history. Actually, they don't know enough, but they know some. But I have a whole lot of international students who've never taken any American history at all. So I have to explain the Civil War in 40 minutes. And you really have to zero in on what the big questions are. But so I like the chance to sort of work through these projects in explaining them to people who aren't specialists in the subject. This is one of the reasons I insist on teaching. One of the reasons that I insist on teaching introductory students, and I like speaking to groups like you because most of you are not professional historians. And so if I can make something understandable to you, then maybe I can make it understandable to my readers. But I've reached the stage with this particular book because, as I've said, it's basically locked into type. I can't make any changes. So if, while speaking to you tonight, I come up with a brilliant insight that I could have used in the book, you will see a grimace pass across my face because I would think, oh, dang, I could have used that. So I will try not to be insightful tonight. And it's entirely out of my own self-preservation. But I am going to tell you about this project that I've been working on. And as Glees pointed out, I've written on presidents. And it is kind of ironic that here I am on the birthday of the first president, speaking for one of the first times on a subject other than a president. Because this book that's going to be published in November, available in bookstores near you, makes a wonderful holiday gift for all your friends who are interested in history, and even the ones who don't know they're interested in history yet. Bulk discounts are available. I'm just kidding. But it is a book about 3 members of Congress, 3 senators. And these are 3 senators who were the rock stars of their era. It was at a time, I could ask this question to you. Glees doesn't count because he's a specialist in presidents. But why is it that of all the presidents in the 19th century, nearly all of them are quite forgettable? Okay, some people will remember Jefferson. Yeah, I mean, but Jefferson's really remembered not so much for his presidency, because he wrote the Declaration of Independence. And then you jump forward to Andrew Jackson. All right, he's a controversial figure, but he's, okay, we'll remember him. And of course, Lincoln. And then who else in the 19th century? And the answer is, I'm a specialist in this, and I have to think carefully about, now wait a minute, when was Franklin Pierce president? Millard Fillmore and Zachary Taylor? Wait, was it Zachary Taylor or Winfield Scott? And there's a reason for this. And the reason is that the American Constitution was not written with the presidency at the center of American politics. If you pull out your pocket constitutions, and I assume you all have them, you'll be reminded that the presidency is described only once you get to Article 2 of the Constitution. Article 1, the most substantive, the longest article, is about Congress. And the framers of the Constitution assumed and intended that American politics, the American Republic, and eventually American democracy was going to be driven by the representatives of the people, the members of the House of Representatives and the senators. And the president was a chief executive. His job was to execute the will of members of Congress. Presidents were not expected to take the initiative. They were not expected to drive policy. They were not expected to be the centerpiece of American politics. That's what was fully expected. That's what was intended. And so the fact that it's hard to remember presidents from the 19th century is exactly what James Madison and Alexander Hamilton and George Washington and Benjamin Franklin, all the framers of the Constitution, would have said, that's what we were aiming for. We want these people to be unmemorable. The stars of the show are going to be members of Congress. And so I decided to look in on the 3 most noted members of Congress during the first half of the 19th century. And this was part of, I will admit, my continuing recovery from writing biographies. Some of you who've been here more than once will know that for a while, I had this long-term project of writing the history of the United States through biography. And I eventually wrote 6 volumes in this collection. And the 6 volumes began with Benjamin Franklin, and then went to Andrew Jackson, Ulysses Grant, Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, Ronald Reagan. And if you read those biographies, They link together to form a history of the United States from the 18th century to the 21st century. And when I started off, I thought this was going to be a great idea. And I still think it's a pretty good idea. And needless to say, I recommend it to all of you. Every house should have the set. But one of the things that I concluded by the time I got to the end of this was that there are certain things that are hard to tell. There are certain stories that are important but hard to tell if you confine yourself to biography. And some of it has to do with the fact that if you were writing about presidents, and I didn't intend to write primarily about presidents, but I eventually did because if you're trying to tell the story of the United States, the president is a very convenient character to hang your story on. But there's a lot going on that presidents don't, if the president is your focus, that you can't really get at. And some of it has to do with sort of the give and take, the thrust and parry of what goes on at the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue. The other thing was that when you write about a president, when you write a biography of any kind, you cannot help but give the impression that the world, or at least the world of your book, revolves around one person. And the world does not revolve around any one person. So I thought, let's broaden things out. Now, when I was here last year, some of you who were here heard me speak about my sort of first foray in this direction, where instead of writing about one person, I wrote about two people. The book is called The General versus the President, about Harry Truman and Douglas MacArthur and the fight they got in. This time, I decided to expand it even more. Because one of the nice things about writing about two people is you can give sort of two sides of the argument. And you don't have to focus on one side and then just bring the other one in by indirection. So I could focus on MacArthur and Truman, and they had this titanic battle. And by allowing myself both characters and bringing both characters up, I can tell this story and I think do justice to both sides. So this time I decided if 2 is better than 1, then 3 is even better than 2. But there's another reason for this, and that is that these 3 men during their lifetime were often called the great triumvirate of American politics. And the term was not always intended complimentary, because you remember that the various triumvirates were in Rome when members of the triumvirates are trying to subvert the Republic. So, in fact, this was the intention of some of the people who called these guys the great triumvirate. But also because, well, if you remember your days from junior high school, you might remember that a relationship between 2 people, whether it's sort of friends or a romantic relationship, if there are 2 people involved, that's one kind of relationship, but it gets a whole lot more interesting when you add the 3rd. Because there are all sorts of complications that ensue, and who's up and who's down, and who's allying with whom. And that's exactly what I was looking for. And in fact, that's exactly the way it turned out in these guys' lives. Now, from the standpoint of me as the author, they were very thoughtful in the timing of their lives. So I'll tell you a little bit about them because I realized that my 3 characters, although household names during their lifetimes, more famous than most of the presidents of their lifetimes, they're not exactly household characters these days. So the 3 men are Henry Clay, John Calhoun, and Daniel Webster. They all began in the House of Representatives. Henry Clay accomplished the feat never accomplished before and never repeated. He became Speaker of the House, the most powerful individual in the House of Representatives, on his very first day in the House of Representatives. He was that impressive. And he essentially created the role of Speaker of the House, a role that's very important to this day. Henry Clay was from Kentucky. He was born in Virginia, but as a young, aspiring lawyer, after getting his training in Virginia, he decided that he would have better prospects as a lawyer by moving west to Kentucky, which originally had been the western province of Virginia. And he set up shop in Lexington, and he went into politics at a fairly young age. This also was what ambitious young men did. And there was an attraction of doing it in a place like Kentucky because Kentucky was a new state. It was writing a new constitution. It was electing new members to Congress, electing new senators. One of the main reasons that people went west was the professions they were interested in were crowded in the East. It would have been hard to break into politics in Boston or in New York. But you go out to Kentucky, and everybody else is new, so you can get a start as well. So this is Henry Clay. John Calhoun was from South Carolina. John Calhoun, like Clay, was a lawyer. He was born in South Carolina. He was educated at Yale. He went to law school, but he returned to South Carolina. South Carolinians did that in those days. In the early 1800s and the 1790s and the early 1800s, it wasn't out of the question. It wasn't that unusual for a Southerner to go north for education. But they rarely stayed in the north. Usually they came back home. And South Carolinians are very proud of their South Carolina roots, and Calhoun was one. Calhoun, like Clay, began by being a lawyer, but being a lawyer often involves people, it certainly did involve people, in matters of public concern. So the connection between law and politics was well established in those days. And Calhoun decided to go into politics. He married well. Married well usually meant that you married somebody with some money. And so he didn't really need to make much of an income. And he could indulge his political interests. And he, like Henry Clay, was elected to the House of Representatives. This is pretty much where everybody got started. And he was distinguished from early on by his very incisive mind, his ability to make forceful arguments. He was a strong partisan. He was a member of Thomas Jefferson's party, the Republicans. These days they're often called the Democratic Republicans to distinguish them from the Republicans of the 1850s that we have until today. But in those days they simply called themselves Republicans. So Henry Clay was a Republican. John Calhoun was a Republican. The third member of my trio is Daniel Webster. Daniel Webster was born in New Hampshire. He became a lawyer. And he was probably the most gifted of the three. Daniel Webster is probably the greatest orator in American political history. One of the things that drew me to these three guys, all three of them, were very powerful speakers, very persuasive speakers. And one of the things that drew me to write about them was that I'm kind of a sucker for people who know how to use the language. Now, I'm a writer, so I mean, that makes me interested in that stuff. But also, one of the things that I constantly tell my writing students is there are sort of styles of language, there are ways of writing, depending on who you're writing for, what your audience is, what you're trying to accomplish. And when I chose to write about the three guys, I knew that I was going to be transported back to a time when political rhetoric was really important. Now, this because, well, to put it very bluntly, there wasn't a lot else going on at the time. And so when Daniel Webster was going to give a speech, this was high entertainment. This is why, for example, some of you will know or know of the Lincoln-Douglas debates of 1858. This was the big deal in American political life in the summer of 1858. Now, how many of you have read any of the Lincoln-Douglas debates? Okay, a few. And those of you who've read will know that, boy, it's a tough slog. Because they would get up and speak so one of them, depending on who went first. If Douglas went first, he'd speak for an hour. Then Lincoln would respond for an hour and a half. And Douglas would get 30 minutes to finish up. And so it would take all afternoon. And it was like going to a double feature of the movies. Well, you know, back in the 1930s when people went to double features, nothing else to do, so you might as well spend all afternoon in the movie theater. Same thing was true with political debate. But although the Lincoln-Douglas debates, after a while, they get kind of tedious. They get kind of tedious, you read all 7 of them. You know why they get tedious? Because they repeated themselves from one debate to the next. Why did they repeat themselves? Because they weren't recorded. The audience hadn't heard it before. So it was new, which meant that by the time you got to the 7th debate, you could really have this thing down. But the other thing was, and this is one of the reasons that I was so intrigued by my 3 characters, this was a time when political speech mattered. I don't know if any of you are, well, we're on C-SPAN, so I should say that you're all fans of C-SPAN. And I'm sure you're glued to the C-SPAN cameras when C-SPAN is covering Congress. And you will know that you can turn on C-SPAN most of the time during the week, and you can see people giving speeches in Congress. Now, I'm probably not giving away any state secrets to tell you that if they panned the camera, you would realize there's nobody in there. Nobody's listening. They're speaking simply to the camera. Because we live at a time when American political institutions have sufficiently matured. One could say they've grown so rigid, but they have evolved in a way so that political decisions are not made on the basis of speeches given in the Senate or in the House of Representatives. Political decisions are made for other reasons, sometimes having to do with party considerations, sometimes because of the effect of lobbyists. But the decisions are not made there in the House and in the Senate on the basis of who said what. We live in a very mature, again, maybe ossified system. But in the days of Henry Clay and John Calhoun and Daniel Webster, this was not so. We had very immature institutions. And when institutions are immature, then the role for individuals is much greater. And when Henry Clay gave a speech, he really did change minds. When Henry Clay would debate John Calhoun, and then Daniel Webster would rebut the both of them, people listened, and they listened carefully. As a sideline, these speakers would write out their remarks after they had given them and put them into print and sell them as pamphlets. And they had a side income in doing this. So this was a time when if you listen to Henry Clay talk about the need for a protective tariff, he was pro-tariff. He thought American industry needed to be protected from foreign manufacturers. And then you listen to Daniel Webster oppose this. One of the striking things to me is how sophisticated these arguments were. In fact, I probably give more time to these speeches, to these arguments, than maybe I should have, simply because I was very impressed by the details, by the insight of the arguments, and how modern they sound. So if you listen to Henry Clay argue in favor of protective tariffs, it's essentially the same argument, although I will say, with no disrespect to the president incumbent of the White House, a whole lot more sophisticated than the argument that Donald Trump makes for protective tariffs. And when you hear Daniel Webster say, this is a terrible idea, his arguments could have been used and have been used by advocates of free trade, which has been America's general policy since 1945. So I'm going to digress a little bit to say that one of the reasons I study history, and one of the things that I try to get across to my students is, and why anybody should study history, is to be reminded that we are not the first generation ever to walk the earth. You know, it's really tempting to think that what happened before doesn't matter, and our problems are going to be solved by us. Well, you know, everybody wants a time machine. Now, most people want a time machine to go to the future to find out what the future is going to be. That doesn't work. We don't have those. And even if we had such a thing, they're a kind of contradiction in terms, because if you could go into the future and you could see what the future was, then you come back and change this moment, and then that would screw up that future. But we do have a time machine, and it goes back to the past. And we can see how previous generations have dealt with difficult issues. Now, the tariff was a minor issue for most of this time, but it also became a very acute issue at a particular moment. So I've introduced my characters: Clay, Calhoun, Webster. Now notice that Calhoun is from the South, South Carolina, so the most southern of the southern states. And from the standpoint of those looking ahead and knowing that there is tension between North and South, it's South Carolina where the tension always starts. And it's South Carolina, of course, was first to secede in 1861. Daniel Webster is from the North. He was originally from New Hampshire, but when he was trying to expand his law practice, he moved to Boston. And so he is a member of Congress, a senator, who is claimed by both New Hampshire and Massachusetts. But he is the spokesman of New England, which is sort of the most northern part of the North. So we've got the most southern part of the South, the most northern part of the North. And Henry Clay is from Kentucky. Kentucky's a border state. Kentucky was considered the West at the time. So we've got this regional arrangement among the three. And because, as I've said, these threesomes are kind of unstable, one of the striking parts of the story is the alliances, the shifting alliances among the three, because at any given time, two are lined up against the other. And which two it is depends on the time, depends on the issue. At the same time, each one is ambitious. Each one would love to be president. Now, this is kind of an interesting aspect of this story because, as I've said, these guys, the three of them, were more influential than all but a couple or three presidents of the United States. But there is something about ambition that says it's great to be one of, so there, by 1850 there were 60 senators. Okay, so it's great to be one of 60. But to be one of one, to be president of the United States, even if the presidency wasn't as big a deal as it would become, nonetheless it was tempting. And all three of them are trying to figure out, how can I become president? So part of it is personal ambition. Part of it is representation of their particular section. So John Calhoun eventually becomes the spokesman among all spokesmen of the South. And Daniel Webster becomes the spokesman for New England. And Henry Clay is the one who's trying to bridge the gap between the two. So these are my dramatis personae. These are my characters. My story unfolds between the War of 1812, which is how I begin the story, and the Compromise of 1850. The War of 1812, believe it or not, begins in 1812. And so two of my figures are in favor of the war. They're called war hawks. This was a relatively new term in American politics. And Henry Clay and John Calhoun are beating the drums for war. The United States is going to confirm its independence of Britain by going to war against Britain, because Britain has been preying on American commerce and kidnapping American sailors and doing various things that annoy people like Henry Clay and John Calhoun. And they believe that it is necessary for American pride, American sense of self-worth, to take on the British and to win, to confirm American independence. Daniel Webster is very skeptical of this project. Webster believes that Henry Clay just wants to conquer Canada to get more land in the West. And John Calhoun is part of this conspiracy to boost the fortunes of his political party, the Republican Party. Daniel Webster is the spokesman of New England, but also of the Whig Party. Well, originally, of the Federalist Party at first. And the Federalist Party is the party that, this is where things get complicated. That's one thing that Cleves and I talk about, is that one of the things that attracts me to history, the study of history, is the fact that history is like an onion. And you peel it, and you think you see what the situation is. You peel it, and there's more inside. You peel it again, there's more inside. It's always more complicated than you think. But anyway, so Webster is a spokesman of New England, which has close commercial ties with Britain. And New England is very dubious about the project of war with Britain, to the point where, and this is where the story gets complicated and interesting and important for the future, Daniel Webster becomes a spokesman for, potentially, the secession of New England from the Union. Now, we think of secession as something that the South did in 1861 that brought on the Civil War. But one of the major currents of my story is that this idea of what does the Union consist of? What are the obligations of the states to the rest of the country? This was something that was in flux from the beginning. Now, the fundamental question that gives rise to the Civil War, one thing I should say is that when I'm writing my story, I try to forget that I know what's coming. I'm quite serious about this, because the only way you can understand history is to abandon hindsight. Because if we know how it's going to turn out, then we don't pay attention to what it was like to live through it, to not know what's going to happen. Now, I know that by the end of my story, the Union is doomed, that the Civil War is going to come, and that it's going to have to be fought over to be maintained. So I know this is coming, but I have to resist that knowledge, because My characters didn't know that. And they were doing, well, two of them were doing their best to prevent the wreck that they saw potentially ahead. The third, John Calhoun, was doing his best to make the wreck happen. But that's a part of the story. Anyhow, so when we look back on the 19th century, we talk about secession, we think of the South leaving the Union. And if most of you, perhaps, I'm guessing most of you are from Michigan, do we have, just out of curiosity, do we have any Southerners in the audience? Okay, we got a couple. So I won't expect unanimous vote on this, but you know, it's probably fair to say that most people in the North today think that secession was a really bad idea. I mean, I've been living in Texas for 35 years, and most Texans, even today, acknowledge that secession maybe wasn't such a good idea. I might overstate this, because I don't want to speak for you, having grown up in Texas. But the fact of the matter is, I mean, we associate this with something that that the South did. But the first part of the country to seriously talk about secession was New England. And it wasn't over slavery, it was about war policy. And the fact that the war against Britain was destroying New England's trade. New England lived by trade. You can't farm very well in New England. You can fish and you can engage in trade. And New England traded a lot with Britain. And the vote in favor of the War of 1812 didn't include New England's votes. And New England states, especially when the war was going badly, during all but its last 2 weeks, said this was a lousy idea to go to war, and you know what? Maybe the Union was a lousy idea. And so Daniel Webster, who had a very keen legal mind, started making the argument for secession, New England secession. Now, after Andrew Jackson miraculously won the Battle of New Orleans, Webster would rethink and start to backpedal really quickly. But one of my broader themes is that this question of, is secession legitimate? Can the states interfere with the enforcement of federal law? Again, this is going to be pinned on the South in the 1860s. And this is the justification for Abraham Lincoln and the Union fighting against Southern secession. But it came up first, for my guys, in the War of 1812. It came up a second time in the early 1830s, when South Carolina threatened to leave the Union, not over slavery, not over war policy, but over a tax, a tariff. And you might think, people can get that worked up over a tariff? And the answer is yes, because let me ask you, if you had to summarize the causes of the American Revolution in a slogan of 4 words, what was the slogan? Actually, that's not a bad one, but no taxation without representation. The American Revolution was all about taxes. People took taxes seriously in those days. And South Carolina was all set to leave the Union because they didn't like a tax bill that Congress had passed. And this because, well, people like John Calhoun had this well-articulated theory of how the Union had been created by the states. And Calhoun laid the groundwork for secession based on this theory of states' rights. And, you know, the question, the underlying question here is, and it's a question that is still with us, although thankfully not in such an acute form. The question is, in our federal system, we have a central government and we have state governments. Which level of government is supreme when push comes to shove? Do the states get their way, or does the national government get its way? Well, the Constitution is rather vague on this. And at the extreme end, can states leave the Union? Can states constitutionally leave the Union? The Constitution is silent on this. Why is the Constitution silent on this? You know why the Constitution is silent? Everybody at the Constitutional Convention knew this could be a difficult issue. This could be a problem. But they remain silent. You know why they remain silent? By the way, why do politicians remain silent? Politicians are not a silent group. Why do they remain silent? Because they needed to get it done. They knew if they wrote in that, you know what, there's an escape clause here, well, that would ruin the whole project, because the whole project was to create a stronger government. But if they said you can't leave, well, then the states, half the states wouldn't have signed. So they deliberately fudged this, and they kicked the can down the road. They left it to my group, my three guys, and their generation. The title of my book is going to be Heirs of the Founders, the people who inherited this project. So one fundamental problem with the Constitution that they had to deal with is, what is the nature of the relationship between the central government and the states? The second issue, which is going to be the one that dominates discussion starting in about 1830, is the other fundamental flaw in the Constitution. Now, a lot of people like to revere the Constitution, and it's a big step forward from the Articles of Confederation. But the framers of the Constitution knew that there were two huge fudges, or basic, what shall I say, pregnant silences in the Constitution. One is this question of, when a conflict arises between the states and the feds, who wins? And they deliberately left that silent because they knew whatever they said, it would screw up their project. And the second one was, how does slavery exist in a republic? A republic is based on the will of the people. And political power is supposed to emanate from the people. The government is supposed to represent the people. But how can this coexist with a system of labor mobilization that says that 4 million people by the time of the Civil War are not even people at all? They're not citizens. They're not represented. And the framers knew that this was a fundamental problem. Why didn't they deal with it? Why didn't they say, let's get rid of it? Again, because they wouldn't have gotten their Constitution in 1789 if they had answered this. So what did they do? Well, they basically took the position that Benjamin Franklin articulated when he came out of the Constitutional Convention. And he said, this is not a perfect Constitution, but it's the best we can do under the circumstances, and we will leave it to our heirs to fix the problems. And, they'd come a long way since 1776 to get to 1787. But they knew that they hadn't finished it, and there was work to be done. So the work was done by my guys. And I will tell you that I would say they did their best, maybe, to the extent that people who are ambitious, people who have strong opinions, people who are torn by the kinds of personal tugs on professional accomplishment do. These are strong-willed people. And my story progresses through, from the War of 1812 through the crisis of 1833 my story culminates with the Compromise of 1850. The Compromise of 1850. It's called the Compromise because, people on both sides, North and South, had to compromise their issues to come to some kind of agreement that wouldn't blow up the Union in 1850. And this gets at the what I'll call the underlying moral question of this whole story. And one of the reasons that this story, I think, continues to have resonance, leaving aside sort of the political aspects of it. But the question is this. It's a question that's most clearly personified by Henry Clay. Henry Clay is somebody who, in our way of thinking, is a contradiction in terms. He is an emancipationist slaveholder. He owns slaves, and he does not believe in the institution of slavery. Now, again, what? What about this? How does that work? Well, Henry Clay inherited slaves, and Henry Clay lived in a society, he lived in Kentucky, which was a slave state, where this was the way work got done. But he believed that slavery was bad for slaves, no surprise there. He believed that slavery was bad for slaveholders. He believed that slavery demeaned manual labor and that it was going to be a problem. It was going to be worse than a problem. It was going to be a continued peril to the Union. And he tried again and again to get Kentucky to end slavery. But he didn't win. He didn't win the argument. Yet he continued to work against slavery, even as he worked to hold the Union together. Henry Clay had to make this decision. And it's a fundamental question for anybody who lives in a democratic political system. It's really a question of anybody who lives in a community. What do you do when you believe that your community, your country, your state is doing something fundamentally wrong? It might be simply misguided. It could be downright evil. What do you do? Do you sort of throw up your hands and say, I have no responsibility for this, and chart your own individual path? Well, not if you are someone who believes that there is a role for statesmen. Because Henry Clay believed that slavery must disappear from the Union. It would. But he also was one who fundamentally disagreed with abolitionists who said that slavery has to end now. Because Clay understood that if the abolitionists had their way, if Congress could somehow vote to abolish slavery right now, then 30 seconds after that, a war would break out between North and South. And Henry Clay believed that as bad as slavery was, and as demeaning as slavery was to the meaning of republicanism, it wasn't as dangerous to personal liberty and to sort of the welfare of humanity as the destruction of the Union. For Henry Clay, almost any compromise was acceptable in order to hold the Union together, because he looked at the Union that he and his other contemporaries had inherited from the likes of George Washington, and said, we need to preserve the Union. The Union is the surest guarantor of personal liberty. And if we have to compromise with the slaveholders for a while longer, we will do that. I maybe not going to give much away when I say that Henry Clay was the model of what Abraham Lincoln wanted to become. Abraham Lincoln was one who also believed we have to hold the Union together. If we hold the Union together, we can eventually get rid of slavery. We can preserve American freedom. If the Union falls apart, then all bets are off. The story ends for me with the Compromise of 1850, which is this great effort to solve all the problems confronting the country. It was this big package deal. And all sorts of issues were tied up, and Henry Clay believed that it was the great accomplishment of his career. He had held the Union together. In fact, the Union didn't hold together very much longer. My guys, they die. And of course, the three of them, they died within about 18 months, between 1850 and 1852. I'm not going to say that if they had lived, things had been different. But in fact, Henry Clay's hope for the Union was dashed on the rocks of the election of Abraham Lincoln and the secession of the South beyond that, and the Civil War. And so, well, I'll stop there. In part because, you want to know what? I told Gleaves this. I haven't told anybody else that. But I'm working on a sequel, which is going to carry it up to the Civil War. So I'm going to leave you all hanging at the end of the book. And what's going to happen next? Hey, guess what? Anyway, I want time for questions. So you're going to ask a question, and I will repeat the question so that everybody in the audience can hear and everybody in the television audience can hear. So right here, sir.
You're leaving out the third branch of government, John Marshall. What's the relationship?
I'm glad you asked the question. The question is, what about the third branch of government? You mentioned John Marshall. Other people call it the judicial branch. But in fact, in this period, John Marshall is the judicial branch. In fact, this is a very important part of my story, because I devote a chapter to Daniel Webster and John Marshall. John Marshall was Chief Justice of the United States from 1801 to 1835. He essentially created the modern Supreme Court, and especially he created the idea that the Supreme Court should stand in review of the actions of the legislative branch and the executive branch. That the Supreme Court, the judicial branch, is the one that gets to say, yep, no, yes, constitutional, unconstitutional. Who created, well, basically the Supreme Court we have today. And he did it, I'm not going to say out of whole cloth, but it would have shocked and surprised the framers of the Constitution. That what? The courts get to tell Congress what Congress can't do? It's not written in the Constitution. John Marshall has to work between the lines to come up with that. And his principal collaborator, one could almost say his co-conspirator, was Daniel Webster. Daniel Webster was the most celebrated and the most amply compensated constitutional lawyer of his day. And in fact, Webster, on some days, in the morning, he would go and argue a case before the Supreme Court, and in the afternoon, he would go give a speech in the Senate. And so the story of Webster and Marshall and the creation of what you could call sort of modern judicial nationalism, the idea that the Constitution really is as strong as it's going to become, owes to John Marshall and it owes to Daniel Webster. And it also demonstrates Webster at his oratorical finest. So I have Webster arguing he argued a whole bunch of important cases, but one was the Dartmouth College versus Woodward case, in which Webster was an alum of Dartmouth College. And he was brought in. Webster was basically a hired gun who would be brought in to argue before the Supreme Court because he was such a powerful speaker. And he would follow the case fairly casually, and then he'd jot down a few notes, and he'd come in and speak for 4 hours, and would mesmerize the audience in the court, and would sometimes freeze the justices. And in the case of Dartmouth College, his speech was so poignant that there was a Yale law professor who went to watch because he knew that Webster was this very powerful speaker. But he also knew that John Marshall wasn't a pushover for anybody. And he had heard that Webster sometimes tried to play on the emotions of his audiences. And he thought, boy, this isn't going to work with John Marshall. So he goes down and he watches. And he's mesmerized, and he sees that the members of the court are mesmerized as well. And when it finally comes to the end, when Webster says, it is a small college, but there are those who love it. Speaking of Dartmouth College, which he argues is being beaten up, taken advantage of by the state of New Hampshire. And at the end, when Webster has concluded, this skeptical Yale law professor looks, and he sees to his amazement that John Marshall is weeping. That Daniel Webster had that effect on people. So it is an important, it's a large part of my story. Somebody else had a question. Yes, sir.
I just wonder what your thoughts would be. Do you think that as a society we would be where we are today without the Civil War? In other words, the country was, with the development of Eli Whitney, the cotton gin was changing, becoming more industrialized. And you have the Industrial Revolution, the cotton gin actually would ease the picking of cotton and so on. Then you have urbanization and the automobile, and a lot of the people from the South going to the bigger cities like Detroit and so on. And if you didn't have the Civil War, you probably wouldn't have the 13th Amendment, which freed the slaves, even though
Right.
there was no war going on. But do you think that as a society we would be more or less where we are today without the Civil War?
Yes, in fact, I think would be farther along than we are today, and I'll give you my reasoning. Obviously, I can't prove this, but I'm going to argue a counterfactual. And this is something that Henry Clay was hoping for and was counting on. Henry Clay, again, being from a border state, Kentucky, being a slaveholder who didn't believe in slavery, hoped that slavery would go away, observed slavery in his lifetime go away in the North. When he was born, slavery was allowed in every American colony and in every American state upon independence. But gradually, the North ended slavery. Often, it was phased in emancipation. So New York ended slavery, but there were still slaves in New York as late as the 1830s. So it was a phased kind of emancipation, which is what Henry Clay was arguing for. Immediate emancipation would be unfair to all sorts of people, starting with the slaveholders, but including some of the slaves themselves. If you're a 65-year-old slave and all of a sudden you're emancipated, you get thrown out of your house, you get thrown out, what can you do? So anyway, but Henry Clay believed that the North had emancipated its slaves not out of any fit of philanthropy, but because the Northern economy no longer found slavery profitable. Or to put it another way, every one of the framers' generation, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, all the slaveholders in the 1780s believed that slavery was a necessary evil. They believed it was an evil, but they couldn't figure out how to run the Southern economy without it. And many Northerners took the same view, except they figured out how they could run the Northern economy without it, and so they could focus on the evil part of it. But Washington, Jefferson, Henry Clay all hoped that slavery would become anachronistic in time. And this was what Henry Clay said after the Compromise of 1850. He had been the author of the Compromise of 1820, the so-called Missouri Compromise, that resolved the issue of slavery in the Western Territories and that held for over 30 years. And he said, if this compromise holds for 30 years, then we will have resolved the problem. Because he saw the Industrial Revolution coming. And the Industrial Revolution really was what ended slavery. More precisely, it ended slavery in other countries. Think about it for a minute. In 1800, nearly every country in the world allowed slavery to exist legally. And most countries thought, no big deal. That's just the kind of the way the world works. In 1900, essentially no countries in the world allowed legal slavery. So between 1800 and 1900, slavery disappeared. It was only in the United States that the ending of slavery required, or seemed to require, this horrible war that killed over 600,000 people. So you have to start thinking that maybe there was a way you could end slavery without a civil war. And Clay thought there was. If we could simply keep the Union together for another 20 or 30 years, then Southerners would have come to the same conclusion that Northerners had already come to. We don't need this institution anymore. And if you indulge me for a moment further, if the South had ended slavery without it being imposed by the North, without the need for a 13th Amendment, it didn't require a 13th Amendment for Massachusetts to free its slaves or for Pennsylvania, and so it wouldn't have for South Carolina or any other country, any other state. And if Southerners had freed the slaves on their own, then opposition to things like education for the former slaves wouldn't have been seen as a badge of Southern honor. Anything that gets imposed from the outside by those Northern aggressors is something that patriotic Southerners will be able to resist. And as you know, until the 1960s, Southerners didn't like the idea about being told what to do on race relations. But if Southerners had been allowed the time to conclude on their own that slavery was a bad deal, then they would have had an incentive to invest, for example, in the education of the former slaves. So I'm not trying to guarantee that that would happen, but there is an alternative scenario. And this is exactly what Henry Clay was aiming for. And I should say that by the 1850s, it's exactly what, by 1850, he died in 1850, this is exactly what John Calhoun was hoping would not happen. Because by 1850, John Calhoun had already concluded that South Carolina and the South must leave the Union. And he was simply hoping for an excuse to do it. And the excuse came with the election of Abraham Lincoln. More on the book that I'm writing about. I'm going to write about Abraham Lincoln and John Brown. So it's going to be a twosome instead of a threesome. In the back, sir.
I'm wondering if you would comment on the stated intent of the current administration at Yale to remove the name of John C. Calhoun from one of their institutions. I don't know if it's a building or a school or...
Okay, so, and I'll broaden that. So the question is, what about the campaign at Yale University to eliminate John Calhoun's name from one of the buildings, or it's a college or something like that? And I don't remember how far along that road they are. Okay, but anyway, Calhoun attended Yale, and so he was, at one time, he was considered a distinguished alumnus of Yale College. And these days, of course, John Calhoun is seen as the arch apologist for slavery. I'll just tell you that my general view of erasing names from buildings, taking down statues, is to be very skeptical of this. And I'll tell you why I'm skeptical. And I teach at the University of Texas. And at the University of Texas, there were erected in the 1920s a series of statues honoring heroes of the Confederacy. And following the shootings at Charlottesville, was it the year before last? The administration at the University of Texas decided the time has come to take down these statues honoring the Confederate heroes. And my first thought was, I do not like the idea of erasing history because there is no end to this. And I predicted that if it's today, sort of Confederate heroes, tomorrow it's going to be Thomas Jefferson. And then there will be George Washington, and how's that going to work if the capital of the United States is named for a slaveholder? If we try to go back and impose the standards of the present on the past, then there is no end. And very often I'm going to say, in the thinking of those people who are most in favor of this, there is an incipient perfectionism that if these people are bad on this score, then there's somebody else who's bad on another score, and then I would despair of putting up statues to anybody for anything. Because however much a model citizen they might be today, I can guarantee you that the people who honor John Calhoun is still one of South Carolina's 2 statues in Statuary Hall in the Capitol. And they're not really trying to poke a finger in the eye of anybody else, and they're not a bunch of white racists, you're saying, but John Calhoun was an important figure in the history of the United States. But I had this modest proposal that I actually proposed to the president of my university. I said, don't take down the statues. Just make a very modest change to each statue. And go around to each statue and put a small plaque, maybe about this big, that simply has the year in which the statue was erected. And I thought, do this, and all of a sudden, I've got this outdoor history lesson. And so people can walk around and they can see that the statue that was put up to Jefferson Davis on the UT campus was erected in 1929. What does that tell us? Jefferson Davis was not a Texan, but Texans in the 1920s were trying to make a political point by recognizing Jefferson Davis. But that does 2 things. One, it tells us when this went up, and it gives us an idea of the mindset of the people who put it up. But it also absolves the present of the responsibility for these things that went up 100 years ago. And sort of this is the justification for taking down all this stuff, for changing these names. We don't want this generation to be seen as honoring these people whose values we don't share. And that's fair enough if you're putting up something new today. Okay, Yale or the University of Texas wouldn't erect a statue to Jefferson Davis or name a college for John Calhoun today, but to somehow pretend that it never did, I think that does a disservice to my history students, if only because, so on the campus of the University of Texas, there used to be these Confederate statues. Well, since the Confederate statues went up, there are statues to Martin Luther King. There's a statue to Barbara Jordan, a black congresswoman from Houston. There's a statue to Cesar Chavez. And if these statues were all still there with the dates, then you could walk around and you could see what the administration of the University of Texas valued at different times in history. But now you go around and, I like to think I'm teaching history to my students, and I think they do. But we learn a lot about history from our environment. And if the environment says there never was a Civil War, slavery never existed, the fact that you could see Jefferson Davis honored in the 1920s, and then Barbara Jordan, the great-granddaughter of slaves, honored in the 1990s, that says something about the history of the state of Texas. So that's my long-winded answer to a short question. Other questions? Yes?
What is your response to this idea that these statues, you mentioned 29, this is the time of heavy Jim Crow, and this was, and they were put in public stations to make the statement to the black population, we're in charge. And those statues should be preserved, but moved from the public domain into the museums and preserve them appropriately there. What's your response to that?
Okay, so Jefferson Davis, in fact, there's a separate argument as to the artistic merit of these statues. And these particular statues included some that were by a very distinguished sculptor who did a lot of stuff in Texas. And so it would have been an artistic shame, almost an artistic crime, if the statue had simply been melted down. So Jefferson Davis was moved into a museum on campus. And there is something to be said for that, but there are 2 things to be said against it. One is that my students, I'm not going to say, I'm going to say it, they avoid museums like the plague. They will never see that statue. Otherwise, they had to walk past Jefferson Davis every day. The second thing is, this is maybe a minor point, but statues are designed, the statues that go up on pedestals, they're designed to be seen on pedestals. I'll give you one example. So my older son, Hal, whom Gleave mentioned, who now is a distinguished professor, but he used to be a little kid. And when he was a little kid, there was a moment when Texas I live in Austin, and the state of Texas was refurbishing the Capitol. And on top of the Capitol is this sort of, it's not quite winged victory, it's the goddess of liberty. And this white statue that's, I don't know, 14 feet tall or something like this. And it's designed to be viewed from, well, the top of the Capitol, and you're down below. But it was the day when they were going to take the statue down, and they were going to get one of those big, heavy-duty, double-rotored helicopters. And so it was a big deal. They announced this, they're going to lift it off. And so Hal was about 4 years old. I took him in the stroller, and off we went. And we watched as the helicopter went, wah, 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 and they put the cables over the statue, and they're tugging away, and the rotor was going, and the statue's stuck. And so they have to go, and everybody's down below. Is this actually going to happen or not? So finally they yank it free, and they bring it along. They fly it around a little bit and doing very dramatically. And then they lower it down onto the grass of the Capitol grounds. And so I was able to make use of my little kid, say, little kid here, he wants, can we get to the front so we can see it? He's short. So he works our way to the front. And Hal takes one look at this statue and bursts into tears. Because, I don't know, if, are there any Lyle Lovett fans in the house? So Lyle Lovett has this song. I think the song is called She's Hot to Go or something like this. And he sees this woman from behind. And so he says, boy, she's hot to go, she's ready, and so on. And he goes on and on like this. But then at the end of the song, he comes around, and this probably wouldn't pass muster in this day and age. But he comes around and he says, but she was ugly from the front. Actually, though, and then there's this female voice that comes in and turns him, well, you ugly too. and Lyle Lovett is hardly one to, cast stones. But anyway, but the point was that when Hal saw this statue, it was ugly. Now, why was it ugly? Because it was designed to be seen from 400 feet away at an angle of declination of 45 degrees. It's like stage makeup if you ever go up close. It's supposed to be seen from the last row of the theater. And so for these statues, I've been to see Jefferson Davis up close in the museum, and he's ugly from the front. So, but the larger reason is that you take them sort of out of their native environment, and it sort of solves the problem, but not really. Because you said very aptly, and this is quite true, that it was created to say, we're in favor of segregation of the races. But I want my students to know that there was a time when the university they attended was run by people in their section of the country that was in favor of segregation. Because if you believe in progress, you have to know where you're progressing from. And there's no historical memory against which to judge. Otherwise, the fact that Martin Luther King has a statue on the UT campus, well, big deal. It is a big deal, because that statue would not have been placed there 60 years before. And that's why my little suggestion, just putting the timestamp, it was rejected and the statues went down. Yes. Oh, actually, I'm sorry. I need to get somebody else. But we can follow up maybe later. Yes, sir.
Yeah, you were talking about how all three gentlemen started in the House of Representatives and moved to the Senate.
Yeah.
Then John C. Calhoun became vice president. Did that affect their relationship when he was vice president and then they got back into the Senate?
Oh, it did. In fact, so you're up on their story. So each one eventually went into the executive branch. And John Calhoun was one who was kind of the sneakiest one in the sense of succeeding, where Henry Clay was the one who came closest to being president. Here we are in an event in a presidential library sponsored by a Presidential Studies Center. Trivia? No, it's not trivia, because it's an important question for you. There have been two people in American history who are three-time losers for their party as nominees of their party in races for president. And one was Henry Clay, who lost in 1824 and 1832 and 1844. Who is the only other three-time loser in American history? And I don't get to count Harold Stassen, who was a 16-time loser. Yes. William Jennings Bryan, there you go. And there's something actually important in this. This is no longer the case, but if there are any baseball fans in the audience, there was at one time a phenomenon of, this actually did happen. Being a 20-game winner used to be the standard of excellence. But what was really strange was, occasionally there were 20-game losers. Now you might think, how do you get to be a 20-game loser? Well, you have to be good enough to be in the regular rotation, and you have to be bad enough to lose 20 games, or at least play for a lousy team. And so that sort of accounts for Clay's 3-time losses. But John Calhoun managed to be vice president of the United States. He was one of 5 people running for president in 1824. 5 people running? Yeah, because the first party system of Federalists and Whigs had broken down. And the second party system of Democrats and, of Federalists and Republicans has broken down. And the second party system of Democrats and Whigs had emerged. And so groups could nominate whoever they wanted. So there were 5 people running. John Calhoun realized he wasn't going to make the finals. So he dropped out, but let it be known that he would be delighted for number 2 slot. And so he managed to leverage that into the support of he got the support of Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams. And they all agreed that he was going to be vice president. And so he became vice president under John Quincy Adams. He wanted to run again in 1828. The 1824 was when Jackson was the plurality winner of the electoral vote and the popular vote, but didn't win when the race went to the House of Representatives. But Calhoun is thinking, okay, I'm number 2, and you never know, the president might die, or this might be a launching pad to something. So he manages to finagle his way onto the ticket of both John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson when there's a rerun in 1828. So it's the only case in American history where a vice president under a president of one party becomes vice president immediately of the president of the other party. But it gets complicated because meanwhile, behind the scenes, Calhoun is conspiring in the undermining of federal authority. And so as vice president, Calhoun is secretly urging those South Carolinians who want to secede from the Union. And Jackson is doing everything he can to keep South Carolina from seceding from the Union. And the climax of the tension occurs when it's on a Jefferson Day dinner event. In April, the Jeffersonians, Republicans, then they're about to be called Democrats, they met every year. I think maybe they gave it up a while back because eventually they became Jefferson and Jackson Day dinners. And both Jefferson and especially Jackson have become at least mildly toxic to most Democrats. So I don't think they do it. Do they do it anymore, Jefferson Jackson Day dinners?
Called the legacy dinner.
Okay, like President's Day instead of Washington's birthday. Okay, anyway, so at the Jefferson's Day dinner in 1830, excuse me, when the crisis over South Carolina is developing, the Democrats, we'll call them the Democrats, they all get together and they toast Thomas Jefferson and the principles on which the Union is based. And these toasts indicate their position on various events of the day. So those people who support South Carolina, they endorse Jefferson's Kentucky resolves. Now, we're getting in a little bit into the weeds, it's in the book, where Jefferson in 1798 argues in favor of the rights of states to determine the constitutionality of federal laws. It was in response to the Alien Sedition Acts of 1798, which were an egregious violation of the First Amendment. But the Supreme Court hadn't yet declared the principle that we get to determine constitutionality. So Jefferson and James Madison, who did the same thing for Virginia, they say states get to be the ones to do this. And that's exactly what Calhoun was claiming for South Carolina, the right for South Carolina to declare on the constitutionality of a law, in this case, the Tariff of 1828. So some of the toasts are in favor of the Kentucky resolutions. And this is sort of an indirect support for Calhoun. But the climax of the night comes when the President of the United States, Andrew Jackson, is going to speak. Because there are these scheduled toasts, and then there are the unscheduled toasts. And the President didn't always attend this event. But Jackson did on that night. And he made very clear that he was not going to let the Union be broken up. And so when Jackson stands up, as president, he's the first one in the unscheduled toast. So everybody looks at Jackson. What's he going to say? And Jackson, by this time, is showing his age, and he's not in good health. He never was a public speaker. And so he didn't speak loudly. He didn't speak forcefully. He was no match for Clay or Webster, even Calhoun. But he stands up, and the audience is bigger than this. It's in a hotel in Washington. And everybody is absolutely silent to see what Andrew Jackson is going to say. And Jackson holds up his glass and says, and while staring exactly at John Calhoun, he says, "Our federal union, it must be preserved." So Calhoun is up next, and he's the vice president, and he's got to answer Jackson. He sort of has to answer to Jackson as well. And so Calhoun is trying to think on the fly, because Jackson hadn't said what he was going to say. And he had a chance to prepare in advance. But Calhoun has to figure it out on the spot. And everybody's looking at him. He really is on the spot. So he's thinking about it a little bit. And he says, he raises his glass and he says, "The Union." And for a moment, everybody thinks, my gosh, he's capitulated. Andrew Jackson has carried the day. But he says, and he repeats, "The Union, next to our liberty most dear." Well, that's quite a qualification. It's at that point that Jackson decides that Calhoun has to go. Now, it's complicated by a story that is almost absurd when I relate it, even to you. But basically, the wives of the members of Jackson's cabinet could not get along. This because one woman, Peg Eaton, Margaret Eaton, was, I don't know how to say this without sounding kind of catty, but she was prettier than the other members of the other wives of the cabinet. She also grew up in an inn. And she didn't have a mother, so her father ran the inn, the hotel. And she grew up there, and she was kind of flirtatious. She got better tips if she flirted. And so she was seen as this woman of loose morals. And because she had loose morals, and then she subsequently married a guy who became a member of Jackson's cabinet, then the other wives of the cabinet members refused to attend her dinners, refused to be at receptions with her, and the ringleader of this opposition to Peg Eaton was Florida Calhoun, John Calhoun's wife. And this was the start of why Andrew Jackson never forgave John Calhoun. You might think it was a matter of high policy, and eventually it was. But it started because, well, as Jackson saw it, that Calhoun could not control his wife, and his wife, and therefore through his wife Calhoun himself, was casting aspersions on Peg Eaton. Now, this requires me to tell a little bit about Jackson's personal story with women. His mother died rescuing him from a prisoner of war camp in the Revolutionary War. And Jackson believed that his mother was a saint. And then his wife died because she had been slandered during the campaign of 1828. And under the strain of all of this criticism, she had a physical breakdown that ended in her death. So as a result of this, Jackson could not stand the idea that defenseless women would be defamed. And if Jackson had been alive today, he would have said, "I believe the woman." And this was Jackson's view. And when Peg Eaton said she was blameless, and John Eaton, who was Jackson's personal friend, said, "My wife is blameless," Jackson said, "I believe you." And all these people who are saying that she's not, they can't be part of my administration. But Jackson wasn't a czar. And so he couldn't fire his whole cabinet. Eventually he did. He couldn't fire everybody at once. And the cabinet was paralyzed. And you might think, my gosh, the business of the United States can't go forward because there is this fight among the women. It was called the Petticoat War. But, so this is part of the story, but I'll just conclude. I should probably draw to a conclusion here, but I'll just say that Andrew Jackson is one of the major subsidiary characters. And Jackson's attitude, he didn't have much in particular against Daniel Webster. But Jackson was asked on his deathbed, he was dying in 1845, he was asked what he would do differently. Could he live again? He said, "If I could live again, I would hang John Calhoun and shoot Henry Clay." So we'll leave it at that. Well, I have one more thing to mention. you're about to hear from a group that is going to honor Ralph Hauenstein. And I just want to say a word about Ralph Hauenstein, what he has meant to me, and mostly through the Hauenstein Center. And I was privileged, as Gleaves mentioned, to be able to meet Ralph. This was now, 15 years ago or thereabouts? And I really didn't know anything about Ralph Hauenstein. I'm not from Michigan. But I came to learn about his fascinating and important career. And I was particularly interested in what Ralph had to say about his commander during World War II, about Dwight Eisenhower. Because my first book was about Dwight Eisenhower. And I spent a lot of time studying Eisenhower at the Eisenhower Library, reading everything I could read about Dwight Eisenhower, and trying to sort of recreate the man from the paper trail that's left behind. And at the time I was writing, there weren't very many people left who had known Eisenhower. So I didn't really get a chance to talk to people who knew him. And for the historian, that can be absolutely crucial. There are times when it's utterly impossible. When I wrote about Benjamin Franklin, nobody was alive who knew Benjamin Franklin, so you do what you can. But when I met Ralph Hauenstein, and he could tell me what kind of commander Eisenhower was. I'd heard other people talk about it, but to hear somebody that I could actually ask questions of, and who could tell me about, basically to fill in the personal human detail that often falls between the cracks of the paper record, was immensely valuable to me. Actually, it's a little bit too late. I wish I'd known him when I was writing the book about Eisenhower. But he was wonderful to talk to. He was very approachable. And you'll hear more, I think, about his career. But I would just say that for all the good work that he did while he was alive, his good work continues in the endowment that funds the Hauenstein Center. And so I had a chance to know him during the last years of his life. But I can say that I have been a great beneficiary of the great work that he has done for Michigan, for Grand Valley State, for the Hauenstein Center, and indirectly through anybody who's interested in World War II and anything related to Dwight Eisenhower. So you're going to hear more about that, but that's just my 2 cents on the subject. Thank you very much. You've been a wonderful audience.
I enjoyed that a lot. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight. Bill, what a wonderful job. It's always great to have you join us here in Grand Rapids. And certainly the wonderful relationship we have with the Gerald R. Ford Museum, the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation, and the Hauenstein Center at Grand Valley. We just couldn't do the things we do without this great relationship. I'm Joe Calvarusa, Executive Director of the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation, but tonight I'm here as President of the Michigan Historical Commission. Appointed by the Governor, legislature leaders, and the Commission, for over a century been key to the preservation and recognition of Michigan's wonderful history. Those of us on the Commission receive no financial compensation. Simply put, we receive one of the greatest rewards possible, the privilege of serving the people of Michigan by helping to promote our precious Michigan history. Joining us in the audience tonight is Vice President Brian James Egan, Laura Ashley, Commissioner, Tom Trescott, Commissioner, and Sandra Clark, representing the state of Michigan, Michigan Historical Center, and the Department of Natural Resources. This day focuses on an extraordinary Michigander, Colonel Ralph Hauenstein, who cherished our history, our country, and the world we lived in. The Colonel was an iconic symbol of patriotism, entrepreneurship, and community supporter. Ralph lived an extraordinary life, living to the age of 103, and by his own admission, he never retired. In particular, he was an advocate and benefactor for his community, his country, and the world. Ralph has been internationally awarded the Order of the British Empire by the British government, as well as the French Legion of Honors by the French government. 1 year after Ralph's birth, Michigan leaders showed imagination and foresight by establishing a historical commission that would enshrine our irreplaceable stories. During its 2013 centennial, the commission launched a signature award for visionary public service to the cause of Michigan history, hoping to inspire others to a lofty standard. We call it the MAK Award, the MAC Award. It evokes a glorious achievement that links our two peninsulas and has become to symbolize our state, the mighty Mack Bridge. This MAC Award is named after three of our greatest public servants here in Michigan. Our revered senior statesman, Governor William G. Milliken, our own 9-term former commissioner with 54 years of public service, Elizabeth Sparks Adams, and our state's former chief lawyer, Attorney General Frank J. Kelly, with 37 years of public service, who sometimes has been nicknamed the Eternal General. Like these three public servants after which the award is named, the contribution of Colonel Ralph Hauenstein to Michigan history and to our country is marked by grace, devotion, and determination that those three individuals had. Colonel Hauenstein became a city editor of the Grand Rapids Herald at the young age of 27, supervising 16 seasoned reporters in Ralph's book, Intelligent Was My Life, co-written by Donald Mackley. It says he unwittingly learned the art of developing, quote, all source intelligence, end of quote. And little did he know what role that would play in his life. Ralph joined the military for the second time a year prior to the attack of Pearl Harbor. As Chief of Intelligence Branch of the Army's European Theater of Operations, he worked under General Dwight Eisenhower. In 1944 and 45, he traveled to the European continent. He was among the first Americans into liberated Paris, war-torn Germany, and Nazi concentration camps. Ralph helped to write history as an integral part of breaking the German code, which is an invaluable part of the Allied forces winning World War II. Ralph also helped to preserve history in World War II by assuring the European antiquities were safely held from destruction. Reflecting on his wartime experiences, the highly decorated colonel said, and I quote, "In the 20th century, I saw with my own eyes the worst that leaders are capable of. In the 21st century, I want to encourage the best possible leadership so that the world would be a better place for my children's children." Colonel Hauenstein's entrepreneurship and business career brought to us Goldfish crackers, Andy's mints, and windmill cookies. He was part of a history as a member of the team supervising the first free elections in Russia. Joining him were notable individuals, and to name just a couple, Alexander Haig, James Woolsey, and his dear friend from Grand Rapids, Peter Cook. He supported the Grand Rapids Public Museum as well as the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Museum. With his time, talent, and philanthropy, creating the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies at Grand Valley University brought together his belief of preserving history and making the world a better place for his children's children. Their mission to inspire new generations of leaders devoted to public service. One of the initial initiatives that the Hauenstein Center did was to preserve history in one room. All the books written by the U.S. Presidents, recognized by the Library of Congress as a unique, valuable asset, and here it's at Grand Valley. Thank you. Governor Rick Snyder sent me a letter yesterday, and he wanted me to pass it along to the family tonight, and I'd like to share a couple sentences with you. And I quote the governor, "I would like to take this opportunity to congratulate the family of the late Colonel Ralph W. Hauenstein on being awarded the Milliken Adams Kelly Award by the Michigan Historical Commission. This outstanding accomplishment required great preparation, hard work, and is rewarded with our state's sincere respect and admiration." End of quote. For his years of making and being part of history, educational efforts for future generations, volunteer services, and extraordinary support to preserving history, the Commission has unanimously bestowed on Colonel Ralph W. Hauenstein the 2017 William G. Milliken, Elizabeth S. Adams, Frank J. Kelly Award. Joining me on stage will be my fellow commissioners, representative from the state of Michigan, as well as accepting this on behalf of the Hauenstein family, Mr. Brian Hauenstein. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody. I do have a few words here I would like to share. I'm truly delighted to be able to receive this well-deserved and honorable award on behalf of my grandfather posthumously, and in the presence of many family members that are here today. It's true that over the last century, he has helped shape our history as a community, as a nation, and globally in ways that we can scarcely imagine. A myriad of his stories have been shared through his book and with his friends, but there's a mysterious side of Ralph, Grandpa. Much of those stories will remain untold, perhaps indefinitely. What I can share with you today is that he was as much a leader at home with his own family as he was in his public life. Several of us here today, including my siblings, my cousins, my parents, we all remember the many gatherings that he worked so hard to create for our family. Every assembly was special, but we all distinctly remember the many St. Patrick's Day parties that he held at his place on Woodcliff. Weekends when he pulled together such creations as green popcorn and all sorts of edible green things. As we walked in the house, we would wonder, what's next? What's Grandpa going to pull together? There was one time I remember distinctly, he had taken a chicken egg and poked a hole in the top and the bottom and blew out the yolk and the whites, and then painstakingly entered green Jell-O into the mold of this egg. And he waited for us all to arrive in the house and see this great creation as we peeled away this green Jell-O. I don't think any of us ate that, though. At our annual pig roast parties, you never knew what Papa was going to do next. We all called him Papa, as the grandchildren endearingly termed him. It was at one of these events that he taught us how to catch and clean and prepare frog legs. My summers will never be the same since that date. It's my pleasure to share this evening for the first time to announce to the public that in partnership with the Van Andel Public Museum, we will be launching a temporary exhibit of Ralph Hauenstein in his life of leadership. Opening July 21st of this year, the exhibit will cover his amazing journey from the Grand Rapids Herald city editor to his philanthropic efforts later in his life. We all hope that you can make your way there later this year to enjoy in his life story with us. Thank you and have a great evening.
Thank you, Brian, and the Hauenstein family for sharing this evening with you, because Ralph was an amazing individual, and it was an honor and privilege to be part of this program tonight. Please join us in the lobby. Bill Brands is going to wander, continue answering questions, join in with the Hauenstein family. A little housekeeping: if you left your coat on the second floor, you will now find it on the first floor by the restroom. So thank you so much for coming. Please enjoy the reception.